Indian approach to negotiating with the United States, because you have to think about what it is that U.S. negotiating tactics are trying to deal with. It starts with the idea that India is unique, that it represents a 5,000-year-old civilization, that it is a great civilization to which the world has not given enough credit and honor, and that every Indian negotiator carries this civilization in his briefcase and defends it with great style and urgency. The second key point is the idea of strategic autonomy, that India's foreign policy goal is to maximize its options. In the early years, India introduced to the world the idea of non-alignment, which they were careful to say was different from just not being part of the US or Soviet Cold War alliances. But it had a kind of family resemblance with this idea of strategic autonomy. And so it's the strategic autonomy bit that has survived after non-alignment kind of changed its character with the end of the Cold War. The third point is a willingness to just say no. And this has been particularly important in Indian multilateral negotiations, such as in the World Trade Organization. Trade always involves countries' domestic interests, and India is no exception. And so on a number of occasions, you've had a pretty good consensus among the participants in a multilateral trade negotiation to move forward in a particular direction. And the Indian trade minister would say, no, we're not going to do that, and just wait to see what happens. Most countries are socialized against doing that, particularly in a multilateral setting. India is not. It doesn't usually use the just say no tactic as blatantly in bilateral negotiations. But it has continued in a fairly strong just say no mode when it came to agreements that the US was looking for, with the argument, everybody does it, which is a terrible argument to use with a country that starts with the proposition that they are unique. India has used a modified version of just say no, particularly for defense agreements where the United States had a particular practice that it had used with every other signatory to the defense agreements. India says, we're unique, we're not everybody else, and we're not going to do that. So what is the US approach to negotiating with India, and what are the most effective ones? Resources and Congress is the heavy, and deadlines are part of the standard US playbook. They're not terribly effective with India. Resources have not been used nearly as heavily or as generously as they have with Pakistan, partly because India is a much, much bigger country. So the amount of resources that it would take to impress the Indians would usually break the bank in US budgetary thinking. But we have tried some other tactics which have been more effective. The first is actually playing to India's uniqueness. And there are two fascinating examples of that. The US for years had been trying to get India to sign what it refers to as 3 foundational agreements that are part of a package deal if you're buying arms from the United States. India has been buying actually quite a lot of arms from the United States since, well, I'm speaking in 2017, for the past 10 years plus. But it's never been willing to sign the foundational agreements. How could we get past this for at least one of them? And the one that was first past the finish line was a requirement for end-use monitoring. That's the term that's used by the United States. And the second past the finish line was basically a logistics support agreement. Both of these sound bland and boring and uncontroversial, but in the Indian context, anything involving defense gets to be controversial. So how did we play to the India is unique argument? In both cases, the agreement got a new name. End-use monitoring became visitation or verification. And it wasn't an agreement. This was negotiated by Hillary Clinton. It wasn't an agreement. What it was an informal understanding on what language that would go into future arms sales agreements in order to satisfy the U.S. legislative requirement that we know what is being done with the arms supplied by the United States. And after a little back and forth, we found the magic words, we agreed on the process, and that has worked, not perfectly, but reasonably well. When it came to the logistics agreement, it got a new name, and it was changed from an agreement into a memorandum of understanding, which isn't a terribly big difference, but it sounds different. Basically, the rest of the agreement was more or less acceptable once you had changed the optics of it. Second important U.S. tactic in negotiating with India is the intense focus on the priority goal. And I've only got one example of where that turned out to be the critical ingredient, with some additions of what I've just been talking about, that brought us to an agreement. It was something that everybody had said couldn't be done, and that was this agreement on civilian nuclear trade between the United States and India, which was reached in principle in 2008, but didn't finally get settled until Obama was just about to leave office. They'd been working on it since 2005. Why did everybody say it couldn't be done? The United States is a member in good standing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. India has refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and tested a nuclear weapon. The United States, for many, many years, didn't want to do nuclear trade with India because it was making a point that without being part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you can't be part of the system. And we don't do nuclear trade with countries that aren't part of the system. And the decision was made during the George W. Bush administration that we were going to find a way past that. At every turn, India was looking for the U.S. to confirm that India is a legitimate nuclear power. And the U.S. was looking for a way to give India what it wanted without violating its own commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This isn't the place to go into all of the complications of what that involves. But let me give you a couple of illustrations. The most important one, I think, was the nuclear cooperation agreement that was negotiated fairly early on, 2007. This is an agreement that is required by law for the U.S. to sell nuclear plant and equipment to any other country. So we had to get to yes somehow. India wanted to get to yes, the U.S. wanted to get to yes. Both of them put in place negotiators who had immediate access to the top. In the State Department, it was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Nicholas Burns, and he had access to the Secretary of State anytime he wanted to. In India, it was a man named S. Jaishankar, who subsequently became India's Foreign Secretary, which is the most senior career person in the Foreign Ministry. And he had pretty much instant access to the Prime Minister. So these two people were empowered to do things that would normally have been considered hideous violations of policy. And they could get their positions vetted at the top. Now, that doesn't mean everything went through like a hot knife through butter, but this was a tremendously powerful asset for them to have. And it meant that both sides were able to be much more creative than they normally are, because they knew that their bosses would be willing to go along with changes in policy. And normally, what people know is exactly the reverse. What was done in the nuclear cooperation agreement actually went beyond that. In the legislation that had passed, in the US legislation that had passed, which basically authorized the US government to negotiate with India on nuclear trade, there was a provision that said that if India tested a nuclear device again, that the United States would cut off cooperation. Normally, that kind of poison pill has to be reflected in the agreement, or the country you're negotiating with is going to think that you have decided to ignore it, which was not an option in this case. So, as they were negotiating the nuclear cooperation agreement, how to deal with the question of termination. When you look at the text of the nuclear cooperation agreement, the word termination does not appear. What appears instead is a very long passage. It's somewhere between 3 and 6 pages, single-spaced, very fine print, heavily lawyerized language. And what it does is to spell out everything that would have to happen if either party felt that it was obliged to cut off cooperation. And it's very long, and it talks about different kinds of consultation, and what has to happen when and how long it's going to take. But what it does is to preserve for the United States the option to respond if India does test. India had made a unilateral promise not to test, but it was quite unwilling to turn this into an agreement with somebody else. They walked right up to the edge of that, both bilaterally with the United States and multilaterally in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, but they didn't step over the line as far as they were concerned. And as Ambassador Burns put it, he was the US negotiator, India retained the right to test. The US retained the right to respond. So, intense focus on priorities, willingness to craft something unique. And then I will add something here that tells you something about how India prepares for negotiations. I had a long interview with one of the Indian negotiators in putting together the chapter on nuclear negotiations in the book my husband and I wrote on India's negotiating practices. And I asked him if he, like other foreigners, had found that the US was very legalistic. And he said, "Oh yes, that's true, but you're also very transparent. For instance," he said, "you have 43 agreements on nuclear cooperation. They're called 123 agreements. I have copies of all of them in my binder. We mined those looking for language that we could live with that you had already used with somebody else." So you're dealing with intense staff work on India's part, which means that the US has to do equally intense staff work. And it comes as something of a shock to American officials to hear that they've been bested at their own game.